our university. We're a teaching institution, but one of the things that maybe gets hidden in that is the good work that our faculty, and not just these faculty, but all of our faculty are doing in their scholarship. And so this is an opportunity for us to discuss that. And I've asked them each to give us sort of a 5-minute discussion or description of some things that they have been up to lately. So we'll start with Dr. Bilbro. We'll just go in a line here.
Okay.
So
I'm going to talk about 2 things real quick. One is how I got started in academics, why I became a professor. And then secondly, how I think teaching and scholarship go together, why I think they should go together, okay? So the first thing is, when I started college, I started community college, and I wanted to be I wanted to do either mathematics or engineering. I'm from Seattle, so bowling was big, so I thought maybe aeronautical engineering. I love math, and I got into math, but as I started to feel called by God to go into a vocation in higher ed, and to train young people, I thought, well, I don't really want to be in the math classroom because that's more just content delivery. It's not entirely content delivery, but I want to do something that let me play with big ideas also. But I didn't want to lose the elegance and the beauty of math. So, if you know math, it's an incredibly elegant way of describing very complex relationships. It's absolutely gorgeous. And what I enjoy about English is we get to talk about form, we get to talk about aesthetics, but we also get to talk about big ideas. So I thought it was a good place to go. So I got into English and really enjoyed it in undergrad. Then I got to grad school, and I quickly realized that a lot of the stuff being published in the humanities, I'm trying to think of a polite way to say this, is junk. It's horrible. It's boring. Nobody reads it. It's painful. And I thought, I don't want to write this. I don't want to contribute to this garbage. So I sort of committed myself early on. I said, I'm not going to write anything that I don't want to read, that I wouldn't want my mother to read. Is actually kind of how I said, my mom can't read it, then it's not worth writing. And my mom's very smart, but she's not, she's not a PhD, so I don't want to write stuff that only the PhDs can read. So all throughout grad school, I wrote about aesthetics, about form, and about how aesthetics influence ideas or ethics or big ideas, form and content. And I tried to write about things that I found interesting. So I got a lot of them published. I was fortunate in that regard. I got a lot of things rejected also, but I found that the way to get published is pure persistence. Just keep sending stuff out there. And as I was working through these things, I eventually settled on the topic of sort of aesthetics and ethics in environmental literature. And so my dissertation's on how Christian theology can shape literary aesthetics in such a way that authors write these works that help us to imagine more ethical ways of living with the environment. So all about Christian aesthetics and the ethics that derive from those. So I really enjoyed that project. I found it worthwhile. It was deeply satisfying and enriching for me as a person to do that. And I think it's important. I mean, granted, it's coming out in the book, and I think probably 10 people will read this book, right? And 2 of them were the people who had to read it for the press, the peer reviewers. So, I mean, no one's going to read this, right? I understand that's how it works. But I enjoyed it. And my mother read it, and she said that she understood it and liked it, so I felt validated. So nobody else has to read it now. But, so I still had sort of, coming into a teaching institution, which is where I wanted to be. I didn't want to be at a D1 school where I had to publish a lot. Coming to a teaching school, I didn't want to lose the ability to continue to write, to continue to wrestle with it. And that's for 2 reasons, really. The first is that I think I would be a worse teacher if I am asking my students to do the incredibly hard work of writing, but I am not doing that work myself. So if I'm not actively putting my shoulders to the grindstone and actively suffering under the pain of trying to make ideas cohere and trying to make sense of something that I don't really understand yet, then I think I'll be a worse teacher at it. I think there's something to be said for struggling in the trenches alongside students. So that's one reason. I want to not ask them to do something that I'm not going to do myself. The second reason, though, is that my scholarship, if I'm actively researching in areas that are related to my teaching, which I am, then I can teach those texts or those ideas or the writing process more effectively because I've had experience with them. So if I read a book, I can read pretty well now. I've gone to grad school. I can read well. I can get a lot out of the book from the first reading. But if I go back and write about the book, if I construct an argument and write an argument related to a book, I know it on a completely different level. This is, I think, comparable to what it would be like if I asked someone to come and do some plumbing for me in my house who had read about plumbing but had never plumbed before. There are two different kinds of knowledge, right? There's one knowledge you get on the sort of abstract, yeah, I know about plumbing, I know theoretically how pipes fit together and how to avoid leaks and such. But there's a whole different level of knowledge you get when you are forced to actually do plumbing or do electricity or do construction or get your hands dirty doing something, right? And you make mistakes and correct them and so forth. So I think the same thing obtains in teaching, where I can read a book and I can know about an idea, and that's great, but I know it much better if I wrestle with it and if I'm forced to get dirty with it. So I find that when I teach books that I have written about, I teach them much better. So I think that ideally you got to find a balance between teaching and scholarship where they are sort of mutually beneficial activities that support each other. And I'm very grateful to Spring Arbor because it's a place where I think that's possible.
Thanks for the opportunity, Jack. Jack said I teach in theology, and one of the questions that he proposed that we talk about is what drew you to your discipline. So I have to go back to where I grew up in Denver, Colorado, and so I'm very invested in the Super Bowl this year. We'll see, we got a little rivalry here. So, but in Denver there is a park downtown called Confluence Park, and it's called that because it's where different rivers come together and merge. And so when I was thinking about what drew me to this discipline, teaching theology, biblical studies, that image came to mind, confluence, because I think what drew me to my discipline was really a number of factors. It was the confluence of things like personality, interests, skills, closed doors, affirmation, call, opportunity, all of these things coming together. And I want to say that I don't believe in a one-size-fits-all. So my experience and how I got into this field, I don't think is normative at all. One thing I love about the way God works is that there really are no dead ends in a broader sense. God takes where we are and guides us. But I grew up in a household, both my parents were teachers. So it was me, staying after school and always having to kind of be immersed in that academic world. And I did grow to love it. I guess I was a bit like a nerd, and as a child I loved going through encyclopedias and just reading articles and discovering new things. And so I've always been curious about the world and enjoyed learning a lot. I thought as I went on to college that maybe law school and becoming a lawyer would be something I'd enjoy. So I majored in political science, and one of the things in terms of closed doors, I was involved in starting a pre-law fraternity, and we got to invite different attorneys over and talk. And after a while I decided, this doesn't fit me very well. This is just not for me. And so by that time I was a junior, and some panic is setting in. Oh no, what can I do with political science if I'm not going to law? So I had really enjoyed economics as an undergrad and finance courses. And so I decided, I'm going to make this into a major as well. So that kind of led me after graduation to work for a tax software firm. And it was a wonderful experience, tough work, but very rewarding. And the owner was a Christian, and he had an idea that I'm going to, give money if you'd like to go on a humanitarian trip or missions trip, I'll fund it. So I took him up on that one summer and went to Venezuela, spent time in an orphanage, and that was a crucial moment, looking back in my life. Can't say I ever heard an audible voice, call from God, but it was a change in my heart, a deep desire to serve God, and yet not knowing what shape that would take. Since I hadn't had a lot of background in scripture and theology, I went to seminary at Asbury, and that was wonderful. Ended up meeting my wife there, and then in terms of maybe some of the other factors, like affirmation, some of the skills and things I enjoyed, it was meaningful to come into contact with professors and mentors who encouraged me to pursue study. And so slowly it kind of became more apparent that maybe a career in teaching in theology. So that led to looking for opportunities, ended up studying overseas, doing a PhD in Aberdeen in Scotland. And sometimes it's just kind of being in the right place at the right time. I believe it's providence, but willing to take that jump. So I ended up here at Spring Arbor, and this is my 8th year. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. I think one other, sub-point here, how does scholarship inform my teaching? I think back to my undergrad days. It was a Christian college, and what were the classes that really intrigued me the most, that I came out of there energized? And it was the ones where the professor was just thoroughly engaged and passionate about the subject and energetic and provocative in a sense of challenging new ideas. And I had a government prof, Dr. Morgan, who was like that. And it just has, as I look back on it, I think obviously when we get together, what is teaching? Teaching is not just a content dump, into your minds, although content is necessary and, it's not all subjective. And yet, I think there's something more. The teaching is this vibrant engagement with ideas and practices, and this takes place in community. And so I take seriously the Spring Arbor concept, talking about a community of learners. So I am shaped by this community, by you all, and I have a contribution to make. But all that to say is that I think it is part of my duty and joy, really, to be personally invested in what I teach, to be growing, to be learning, learning new things, exploring new, writing, researching, being involved in guild organizations and making presentations and so forth. I love to learn, and if I can communicate that excitement, that joy, I think that there's a contagious spirit, and I certainly pick it up from students, that your love of learning is also very energizing to me as well. So my thoughts on kind of how I got into this and the relationship between teaching and
Well, I'm the token scientist up here, so I guess I'm the black sheep. Well, how did I get into this enterprise known as science? You must understand I was a very strange kid. I was curious. I was curious about everything. You know those really annoying little kids who always ask you why grass is green? That was me. So, and I guess in some ways I was tailor-made to be a scientist because I was just constantly curious. And my dad was a 8th or 9th generation farmer. We are Eastern European by descent. We're Croatian, and my grandfather, well, both grandparents were immigrants, and Croatia is a place that's relatively rocky, but my dad was a grape farmer, and he was a really good grape farmer. We used to go out to test the sugar content of the grapes. You smash the grapes and you take the juice and you put it in a little refractometer and you hold it up to the sun, and then you read it, and if it says 16 or over, you can pick the grapes. Dad would sit there and just 4 days. And more often than not, he was right. He just had a feel for the organism, so to speak. So this curiosity was actually nurtured by a teacher, my high school biology teacher, Mr. Rex Clark, who recognized in me a genuine desire, not just to study science, but to study science at a higher level. Instead of taking the annoying freshman, he actually kind of took me under his wing and he nurtured me. And he scolded me when he needed to, and he corrected me when he needed to, but above all, he always encouraged me to learn more, to grasp this field of life science ever so more tightly. So when I went to college, it was kind of a no-brainer. I was going to study life science. And study it I did. I'm from California originally, so I did all my education in California. And then within a matter of a month, well, 2 months actually, I graduated and got married and left the country and did my first postdoctoral experience in England for 3 years. I was at the University of Sussex in Brighton. And then I went to University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, and then I came here. Well, how does research influence my scholarship? We have a model that we've kind of adopted in the science department, and when I interviewed here, they kept asking me, is this part of the model with which you find resonance? Namely, teaching in the classroom is, to some extent, a bit of a content dump. But in science, why you know something, how you learn something is as important as what you actually know. So our model is to try to shepherd students through this process of research, through this process of discovery. For biochemistry and chemistry majors, they have to do a senior thesis. That includes taking a research question, designing experiments to try and answer that question, and then publishing those results in a senior thesis. And this process helps students learn what this scientific enterprise looks like, what the process of discovery is. Through this process, we've been able not only to train students who've gone on to graduate school, who've gone on to medical school, who've gone on to, any number of things. Some have even seen the light and left science and have become pastors and things like that. But this one student, by the way, who left graduate school to become a pastor, it's amazing to me when he talks about his ministry, just how much his scientific training colors the way he thinks. And his wife, who is a graduate of the theology department, insists to me that that's a good thing, because he looks at his ministry very analytically. And his senior pastors with whom he works are very glad that he has that perspective, because it's a perspective typically they don't have. So that's a little bit about how I got into this whole thing and how we use research to train students. We really see research really as a kind of discipleship in our department. We're discipling students to discover, to wrestle with God's creation, to kind of make it cry uncle and divulge to us its secrets. I realize that sounds very grandiose, but that's more or less how we see it. It's really a very sacred task, and we take it very seriously. Now, sometimes a student comes up with a thesis and they kind of stick their hands in their pockets at the end and say, well, I still don't know. You know what? That's okay. Because sometimes I don't know takes a lot of courage to say, despite expending a lot of energy. That's my story. I'm sticking to it.
All right. Thank you all. I wanted to open with a few questions of my own for us, and we can jump in where you feel led. But I was struck by Jeff's description of knowledge as the person who reads the book on plumbing, but compared to the person who then is dealing with the plumbing itself. And if you've ever been in that situation, you know exactly what he's talking about. You can watch all the YouTube videos in the world walking you through how to do something, and when you do it on your own, you find out your sink is just a little different than the one on the video, and you learn that as you do it. But I was struck by how that connects a lot, like with what you said about your father in the field, and the image of him with the grapes, and that holding up the sort of the technology that allows you to test it versus the knowledge that the farmer has by taste, that it's part of who he is because what he does, the knowledge that he has is not only in his head, but it's also borne out in practicality. And so I wonder if you all could maybe say a little more about how we help our students navigate the very abstract, which is oftentimes what we have to work with if we're talking about theory, if we're talking at the beginning, and then especially at the beginning years of their education, and then move this into a way that this is practically borne out. And I want to be careful not to say that the only thing that matters is the practical. I'm not saying that, but obviously, I think most of us would not look at a graduate who has all of the head knowledge. If we say we have a pastoral ministry student who graduates with all of the knowledge of how to be a pastor, but then has no experience of what that means, or no way to know how to get that experience, we maybe failed. So how do we navigate this?
Well, why am I starting? I guess part of it, I think, in our writing classes, in all of our classes, we make our students write, so that even studying literature is not just read the book and talk about it, but then you have to get your hands dirty. But part of it too, I think, is with our more upper level students, the senior thesis, we can do that, or I'm working with a student right now on some Wendell Berry novels where the students can, Berry published novels early on, and then he published a novel, he revised them and published them later, 15, 20 years later, with slight changes. So she's going through, I've done it myself on one of them, and she's doing the other two, to see exactly what he changed, and then we're going to try to see, once we have the data, once we know what revisions he made, what kinds of arguments we can make from that data. So I'm excited to see that, and I think it's good for the student to kind of go along this process of discovery, because we have no idea what we're going to find, right? We have some hypotheses, but we don't really know. So I think the more that we can help students to engage that process of discovery in different ways, different levels, help them see what research looks like, the more they learn. They really start to actually learn.
Yeah, I think in the area I teach in theology, the question you raise is fascinating, and for me, it's a very personal journey to get to that, to move in that direction. Insofar as we're a Christian institution, Christian ethos, and so forth, and especially some of the distinctives at Spring Arbor, experiential learning, personal relationship with Christ, community, and so forth, we do have some advantages over other institutions that would be more exclusively head knowledge. But I think in terms of knowing God, there is always this temptation to keep this knowledge at arm's length, to keep it on the abstract level, because then we feel like we have a sense of control over that. We generally like to be in control. But St. Augustine, I think, was onto something when he talked about this very dynamic relationship between knowing and loving. And so say the more we know God, the more we love God. The more we love God, the more we know God. So I think the way that we certainly do at Spring Arbor have in our department internship requirements and practical ministry experience, and that's essential. At the same time, I think one of the foundational planks is this notion that there is a knowing here, but then there's a knowing here. And the call for us as Christians and also as lifelong learners is to not just know in an intellectual way, in an abstract way, because then we can keep it at arm's length, but to truly know and live that out, to be embodying the truth. And so I think I would be so bold as to say my desire for students and the reason that I'm here and what I hope to encourage is simple. Fulfilling the great commandment, loving God and loving others. I think the more we know, the better we're able to love, ideally, if we're willing to be vulnerable. And that's the journey that I'm on, and I'm blessed to be a part of that experience.
Well, I resonate with both of you because in the sciences we have labs. So we talk about things in the classroom and then we go in the laboratory and we do it. We talk about reflexes and physiology, but then we bring you into the laboratory and we, whack your knee and make the leg go out and so on and so forth. You actually get to feel it. You actually get to see, oh goodness, this stuff we talked about in the textbook. My gosh, it works. Oh look. And getting to where you have that feel for the concept, that feel for the organism, just like my dad had. Getting that within, a 2 or 3 hour laboratory is, of course, virtually impossible, but our goal is essentially to equate students enough with the process so that if they wanted to examine it further, they could, or if they wanted to get an internship in, say, a cardiac rehabilitation laboratory, they know how to hook the 12 leads up to the patient or something like that. So during the Renaissance, there was a bit of a revolt against Aristotelian science because Aristotelian science had a lot to do with discovering things through means of syllogistic logic. And it was really the experimentalists who, Galileo and so on and so forth, who came forward and said, you can armchair it all you want, but until you do it in the laboratory, you just don't know. And I love what you said, Jeff, about, until you dig into it, you just don't know. I can't tell you how many predictions I have had that have been fatally wrong, spectacularly wrong, gloriously, wonderfully wrong, because they've run up against that hard rock of reality. They just don't pan out in the laboratory. And I think our lives are very much that way. We can have a very exalted view of what we know, but to quote Porgy and Bess, what you think you know ain't necessarily so. And I think that humility, that's what God calls us to, is that humility, that we are blessed because we can be right, but you know what? We can be wrong too. In fact, we often are.
It seems that too, when we are wrong, is maybe when we experience the most growth.
We learn the most.
Positive growth, I think,
Yeah.
that I wonder sometimes if our students are aware that we make mistakes, that you are aware,
But I mean, I think that's why on my office wall I have all of my, I have some of my rejection letters from journals, because I want students to know that I fail spectacularly a lot. I get rejected a lot, and that's part of the learning process. When they submit rejection letters and they say why, and I learn. So failure is something we have to embrace. And I don't know how to. That's, I think, a hard thing for us to get a hold of in the American culture to celebrate success, but so important.
Yeah, and I think that gets to some theological themes, suffering.
Yep.
Our culture is designed to help us avoid suffering at all costs, and yet, ultimately, it doesn't work. To be human is to suffer. We do realize we're not in control of everything. We do hurt. And the academic process of learning involves suffering. It means we're not always in control. It means we have to do things that we're not necessarily wanting to, or we may have to discover that we're wrong about something that we held very closely, or whatever it is. But I think part of the journey of spiritual transformation is becoming more okay with suffering, recognizing hard work as a necessity. Without it, we really couldn't grow.
It's difficult not to tie failure to personhood and to feel like if we don't do well at something, it speaks to who I am as a person, that I'm a failure in my life then, or in some other way. And in an ideal world, maybe we could really make grades. That doesn't work.
I'd like to quote a great philosopher, my mother, who used to say, there's one certainty in life, and that is you will fail. And here's how you deal with it. Learn from it, get over it, don't let it happen again. That's wisdom from my mother.
Well, you are all in some ways specialists in that you teach within a department, you're housed within a department. You essentially can't be in the sciences without being a specialist. I mentioned this in class today. If you're looking for someone in the neurosciences, it has to be someone who's a specialist, not someone who's a generalist. And so how do we navigate specialization and the fact that we teach generally here as well? And how can we encourage our students that while you're a specialist and you're a specialist and you're a specialist, you also understand things generally and broadly?
Oh, that's a great question. If you are going to get a PhD in a subject, you have to focus on a question. So graduate work demands that you focus. It demands that you specialize. As much as you might want to be a generalist who knows a lot about everything, a kind of Renaissance kind of person, graduate work really, in many ways, militates against that. So, in, I think, our field, where at least I'm called to teach lots and lots of different subfields of the life sciences, and yet I have kind of very specific interests. What my calling then is to read very broadly, always. Even though I have very specific interests, I'm called upon to read very broadly, and I think I do that with some degree of success. You have to ask my students to see if I actually succeed. Secondly, even if I'm not a specialist, I think if you're a specialist, to some extent, it's easy to blow every other field off because, oh, it's just not my bag. Well, you got to make it your bag. Your bag has to get bigger. So you have your bag and your lunch bag, and that lunch bag is your specialty. But you have to allow yourself to be in dialogue, I think. I think dialogue is a good way to put it, with lots of other parts of your subfield. That's at least how I would look at it.
I think exactly right. I think part of it is always to try to expand the context of your work. So that, yes, you know, for me in my dissertation, I had to, my subtitle, I think, said it pretty well. It's the Christian roots of ecological ethics in American literature. And they got to keep adding qualifiers because it can't just be about, you know, the Christian tradition. It's got to be about the Christian tradition and ecological ethics. But I can't do that in the world. I got to do just American, right? So until I can become, you know, the world expert, I got to put a lot of qualifiers. But then, like Mike said, you got to then expand the context so that you understand how your specialty fits in with the rest of the world. So part of that, I think, is for me, is knowing, like I said earlier on, understanding that I'm fascinated with the relationship between form and content, or aesthetics and ideas. And that kind of can have relevance in a lot of different areas. So that's my dissertation is on one instantiation of that, but there's lots of other applications of that. But then also trying to see and learn from as much as you possibly can. You know, and I think so. On the one hand, the PhD does tend to produce specialists. On the other hand, hopefully, those people who are drawn to that are sort of inveterately curious and are interested in a lot of things. And so hopefully that somewhat ameliorates the problem.
Yeah, my dissertation was on one bishop of the church, Irenaeus, and one controversy of his day that he addressed, how to read Genesis 1 and 2 in a faithful Christian manner. So very narrow. I wouldn't have survived it if I couldn't keep narrowing it down. In fact, it was 2 verses, really. So 300 pages on 2 verses. And yet, I think what Jeff said is right. Personally, you know, I've gone through a bit of a journey, and I had a job offer to teach at the seminary and an offer here, and I was very glad I chose Spring Arbor. It's been, you are paying lots of money to learn at a liberal arts university, and yes, you will get specialized knowledge, but one of the distinctives is that you'll have lots of opportunities to help connect some of the dots, or at least explore connections, ask big picture questions. So what does this matter? And so in the years since I've been here, I have grown to teach more in the area of core, or cross-cultural studies, core 300, core 400. And while I don't want to leave, you know, kind of my specialty in Old Testament studies behind, I really enjoy having a diverse group of students different backgrounds, and asking some of these big picture questions. So what? What does it matter? I think with all of our personalities, we have strengths and weaknesses. I am more of the dreamer. My wife is more of the realist. You know, it's a good thing we're different. I have to push myself to be patient with details, because in my field, you'll get people writing journal articles on one word or one letter, and I mean, for me, it feels incredibly tedious, and I have trouble hanging in there. But that's a frailty. That's my impatience, and what I have learned is that in order for big picture ideas or connections to be sustainable or persuasive, they have to be grounded in the evidence. And so I do have to push myself to be patient, to read those articles, to stay in the field, so that I can, you know, treat the subjects more fairly, I suppose. So I like the way you put it. Like it's a dialogue, I think, between specialization and generalization, but I think Spring Arbor offers a unique opportunity to really see that dialogue ebb and flow.
And I think you need, I say this just because often my students shape my interests. I'll just give you, for instance, I had a student who came to me, he was on the baseball team, and he said, I want to test the effect of branched-chain amino acid supplementation on aerobic activity. I knew zip about putting somebody on a metabolic cart and a treadmill and testing them. Zip. Zero, nada, nil, nothing. And yet Chris kind of got me into it. And he produced this really magnificent senior thesis. And now I'm doing a lot of supplementation studies with students. In fact, some of you may be recruited in the near future if you're a gym rat, by a couple of my students who are testing sublingual B12 supplements on weightlifters. And part of that dialogue is being willing to be stretched into other fields, because your students drag you, sometimes screaming and kicking, to these other places. And I think it's great. It's just great, because now I know something about a field that I knew nothing about just a mere 3 years ago.
And another example, just to show you kind of the variations here, you know, the cross-cultural program got me really involved and interested in the Middle East, and, you know, went to Egypt a couple of times, and, you know, part of that is visiting some of the ancient sites as well. So I started studying up on ancient Egyptian religion, and I was just struck as to points of connection with some of the heresies, the Gnosticism that Irenaeus had opposed, and really to see some of those same tendencies present in contemporary theology. That was exciting to me, to see some connections there. Now, so learning is an expansive field. You might be surprised at where you find, wow, this might fit there, or hold that intention.
Yeah, I think the fear of over-specialization is maybe a good fear, but I think specialization, as you've all said, allows you to maybe think more broadly about things than you imagine when you first specialize. I mean, I'm going to bore you a second here, but I wrote on 3 words for glory and fame in the corpus of Old English literature that exists. You want to talk about tedium? I had an advisor who wanted me to look at every word, which would have taken me a lifetime. And all I wanted to do was finish my degree. And so I spent a lot of time in that. And you know what, I've spent years after that of sort of apologizing to people when I have to tell them what I studied. And I think I've come to a place where I realize that maybe I'm being a bit dishonest when I do that, because it was a sociological study. It was a study in you know, the desires that we have. It was desiring to be known was the title of it. You know, these 3 words, because in Anglo-Saxon culture, there's, at least in the literature, a great desire to be known, you know, in perpetuity, that you will be known forever, and that you'll be an Achilles type, and we're reading Achilles in some classes this semester. We're still reading about this guy. Why? Why do we have this desire? And I've realized that this now allows me to actually make great connections to a culture that we live in today, with the immediacy of Twitter and Facebook, of always wanting to be recognized and to be known, that we've gone from the battlefield to the computer screen, and not apologizing for what I did, but understanding that is something that shaped me as a teacher, probably even more than as a scholar in some ways. I would like maybe to open it up to questions for a few minutes if there are any. We have a microphone.
I'm struck by the role that you all described in terms of where kind of taking chances and failing and recovering from that and moving on, kind of how that plays into scholarship and even personal growth and development. But that got me thinking about kind of the nature of education writ large, and then on this first day of Monday, Wednesday, Friday classes, writ small in my own, and I'm struck with whether or not I communicate in my syllabi that it's good to take a risk and get it wrong and to try an idea out, or if we fall into a trap just following on the heels of the rest of the educational enterprise, that what we're trying to do is say, well, here's the right way you want to answer this question. I'm going to evaluate you against my standard of rightness, which puts the fear of something, maybe not God, but the fear of something in students to say, well, I couldn't possibly really push this idea because he might not like that, and my grade would suck.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think one of the challenges is knowing how to build that into your syllabus in such a way that makes sense with grades. But I know a math teacher at Baylor who 10% of his grade was how well you fail. And I'm still not quite sure how I measured that, and I have no idea how to measure that in a lit class. But I really wish I could figure that out, because what he wanted his students to do is, when they got an answer wrong, that's when you learn the most about math, right? When you get the question wrong, and then figure out what I did wrong, how do I, what's the proper procedure to follow, what's the different procedure I could follow. But I just think that's right. I don't know how it's really hard to make that make sense in the classroom, but I think that's the kind of culture you want to establish.
And I think, the different disciplines address this in different ways. I would imagine in the sciences, the natural sciences, it's a little bit more clear-cut in some ways. This is right, this is wrong in terms of, yeah, you got the chemical composition right, or you just got it wrong. There's a little bit of that in biblical studies in terms of, this Hebrew word can't possibly mean this. You might want it to, but it doesn't. But there is a lot more, we might say, gray area or nuance there in the area of theology. And I think, speaking as an instructor, when I get written work from students, my goal is to see students grow in terms of their curiosity, in terms of their wrestling with the subject, kind of like Jacob wrestled with the angel in Genesis. And so if they end up, with a really weird conclusion or something that just doesn't, ring true, that doesn't bother me as much if they've done the hard work and they're taking it seriously and they're asking questions. It's possible for someone to, be theologically correct and have all their T's crossed and so forth, but have no passion, no heart, no... So I guess to answer your question, I like to see, as much as I can, what is going on in the student's head. Are they wrestling with the subject? Are they challenging assumptions? Are they processing it in an active way, I guess?
Well, John, you kissed the Blarney Stone, as usual. I am blessed with this thing called a really strong personality. And, well, I want students to disagree with me, but they're afraid to. And this is my 15th year here at Spring Arbor, And I really haven't learned how to help students do that is disagree with me better, because I scare them, and I don't try to, I just do. So, all of you sensitive types out there are really good at that. Please pray for me, because that's something I'm still learning. So, one class where we do a lot of this, John, is, I'm sure you do this in your discipline, we have a capstone class, a senior seminar class, and in our class, we talk a lot about the bioethical and environmental sorts of implications of the types of technologies that we use. And there are difficult questions. There are gray areas, to steal a phrase from my learned colleague here. And we will start to get these discussions, and the old strong personality of mine comes out, and all of a sudden students pull back, and I'm still working on that. I really am, and I want students to, so most of the time what I do is just kind of pull back and just let students disagree with each other. But I discover if I don't jump in, they want to treat each other with kid gloves, and I don't want them to. I want them to disagree agreeably, but yet vigorously. And I'm still working on that. Maybe you can come in and show me how the cow eats the cabbage on that one.
Any other questions? Well, we have some time here before the next class, so if you're too nervous to ask here, you can feel free to speak with our guests. So if you would join me in thanking them.